Hi, Pipa. I'm going to read you a story from the Paddington Treasury. It's by Michael Bond with illustrations by Peggy Fortunum, and they're hand colored by Carolyn Newtall Smith. And we're going to start with In the Beginning. And chapter 1 is called Please Look After This Bear. Mr. and Mrs. Brown first met Paddington on a railway platform. In fact, that was how he came to have such an unusual name for a bear, for Paddington was the name of the station. The Browns were there to meet their daughter Judy, who was coming home from school for the holidays. It was a warm summer day, and the station was crowded with people on their way to the seaside. Trains were humming, loudspeakers blaring, porters rushing about, shouting at one another, and altogether there was so much noise that Mr. Brown, who saw him first, had to tell his wife several times before she understood. "A bear? On Paddington Station?" Mrs. Brown looked at her husband in amazement. "Don't be silly, Henry. There can't be." Mr. Brown adjusted his glasses. "But there is," he insisted. "I distinctly saw it. Over there, near the bicycle rack. It was wearing a funny kind of hat." Without waiting for a reply, he caught hold of his wife's arm and pushed her through the crowd, round a cart laden with chocolate and cups of tea, past a bookstall and through a gap in a pile of suitcases towards the Lost Property Office. "There you are," he announced triumphantly, pointing towards a dark corner. "I told you so." Mr. Brown followed the direction of his arm and dimly made out a small, furry object in the shadows. It seemed to be sitting on some kind of suitcase, and round its neck was a label with some writing on it. The suitcase was old and battered, and on the side in large letters were the words, "Wanted on voyage." Ms. Brown clutched at her husband. "Why, Henry!" she exclaimed. "I believe you were right after all. It is a bear." She peered at it more closely. It seemed a very unusual kind of bear. It was brown in color, a rather dirty brown, and was wearing a most odd-looking hat, with a wide brim, just as Mr. Brown had said. From beneath the brim, two large round eyes stared back at her. Seeing that something was expected of it, the bear stood up and politely raised his hat, revealing two black ears. "Good afternoon," he said in a small, clear voice. Good afternoon," Mr. Brown replied doubtfully. There was a moment of silence. The bear looked at them inquiringly. "Can I help you?" Mr. Brown looked rather embarrassed. "Well, no, as a matter of fact, we were wondering if we could help you." Mrs. Brown bent down. "You are a very small bear," she said. The bear puffed out its chest. "I am a very rare sort of bear," it replied importantly. "There aren't many of us left where I come from." "And where is that?" asked Mrs. Brown. The bear looked round carefully before replying. "Darkest Peru. I'm not really supposed to be here at all. I'm a stowaway." "A stowaway?" Mr. Brown lowered his voice and looked anxiously over his shoulder. He almost expected to see a policeman standing behind him with a notebook and a pencil, taking everything down. "Yes," said the bear. "I emigrated, you know." A sad expression came into its eyes. "I used to live with my Aunt Lucy in Peru, but she had to go into a home for retired bears." "You don't mean to say you've come all the way from South America by yourself?" exclaimed Mrs. Brown. The bear nodded. "Aunt Lucy always said she wanted me to emigrate when I was old enough. That's why she taught me to speak English." "But whatever did you do for food?" asked Mr. Brown. You must be starving." Bending down, the bear unlocked the suitcase with a small key, which it also had around its neck, and brought out an almost empty glass jar. "I ate marmalade," it said rather proudly. "Bears like marmalade. And I lived in a lifeboat." But what are you going to do now?" said Mr. Brown. "You can't just sit on Paddington Station waiting for something to happen." "Oh, I shall be all right, I expect." The bear went down to do up its case again. As it said so, Miss Brown caught a glimpse of the writing on the label. It said, "Please look after this bear. Thank you." She turned appealingly to her husband. "Oh, Henry, what shall we do? We can't just leave him here. There's no knowing what might happen to him. London's such a big place when you've got nowhere to go. Can't he come and stay with us for a few days?" Mr. Brown hesitated. "But Mary, dear, we can't take him. Not just like that, after all." "After all what?" Miss Brown's voice had a firm note to it. She looked down at the bear. "He is rather sweet. And he'd be such company for Jonathan and Judy. Even if it's only for a little while. They'd never forgive you if they knew you'd left him here." "It all seems highly irregular," said Mr. Brown doubtfully. "I'm sure there's a law about it." He bent down. "Would you like to come and stay with us?" he asked. "That is," he added hastily, not wishing to offend the bear, "if you've nothing else planned." The bear jumped, and his hat nearly fell off in his excitement. "Oh, yes, please, I should like that very much. I've nowhere to go, and everyone seems in such a hurry." "Well, that settles that," said Mrs. Brown, before her husband could change his mind. "And you can have some marmalade for breakfast every morning, and—" she tried hard to think of something else that bears might like. "Every morning?" The bear looked as if he could hardly believe his ears. "I only had it on special occasions at home. Marmalade is very expensive in darkest Peru." "Then you shall have it every morning starting tomorrow," continued Miss Brown, "and honey on Sunday." A worried expression came over the bear's face. "Will it cost very much?" he asked. "You see, I haven't gotten very much money." "Of course not. We wouldn't dream of charging anything at all. We shall expect you to become one of the family, shan't we, Henry?" Miss Brown looked at her husband for support. "Of course," said Mr. Brown. "By the way," he added, "if you are coming home with us, you'd better know our names. This is Mrs. Brown, and I am Mr. Brown." The bear raised his head politely twice. "I haven't really got a name," he said, "only a Peruvian one, which no one could understand." "Then we'd better give you an English one," said Miss Brown. "It'll make things easier." She looked round the station for inspiration. "It ought to be something special," she said thoughtfully. As she spoke, the engine starting at one of the platforms gave a loud wail, and a tray began to move. "I know what," she exclaimed. "We found you on Paddington Station, so we'll call you Paddington." "Paddington," the bear repeated several times to make sure. "It seems a very long name." "Quite distinguished," said Mr. Brown. "Yes, I like Paddington as a name. Paddington it shall be." Miss Brown stood up. "Good. Now, Paddington, I have to meet our little daughter Judy off the train. She's coming home from school. I'm sure you must be thirsty after a long journey, so you go along to the cafe with Mr. Brown, and he'll buy you a nice cup of tea." Paddington licked his lips. "I'm very thirsty," he said. "Sea water makes you thirsty." He picked up a suitcase, pulled his hat down firmly over his head, and waved a paw politely in the direction of the cafe. "After you, Mr. Brown." Thank you, Paddington," said Mr. Brown. "Now, Henry, look after him," Miss Brown called out. after them. "And for goodness sake, when you get a moment, take that label off his neck. It makes him look like a parcel. I'm sure he'll get put in a luggage van or something if a porter sees him." The cafe was crowded when they entered, but Mr. Brown managed to find a table for two in a corner. By standing on a chair, Paddington could just rest his paws comfortably on the glass top. He looked round with interest while Mr. Brown went to fetch his tea. The sight of everyone eating reminded him of how hungry he felt. There was a half-eaten bun on the table, but just as he reached out his paw, a waitress came up and swept it into a pan. "You don't want that, dearie," she said, giving him a friendly pat. "You don't know where it's been." Paddington felt so empty he didn't really care where it had been, but he was much polite to say anything. "Well, Paddington," said Mr. Brown as he placed 2 steaming cups of tea in a plate piled high with pastry, "how will that do?" Paddington's eyes glistened. "It's very nice, thank you," he exclaimed, eyeing the tea doubtfully, "but it's rather hard drinking it out of a cup. I usually get my head stuck, or else my hat falls in and makes it taste nasty." Mr. Brown hesitated. "Then you'd better give your hat to me. I'll pour the tea into a saucer for you. But it's really not done in the best circles, but I'm sure no one will mind just this once." Paddington removed his hat and laid it carefully on the table while Mr. Brown poured the tea. He looked hungrily at the pastries, in particular a long cream and jam one, which Mr. Brown placed on a plate for him. "There you are, Paddington," he said. "I'm sorry they haven't any marmalade ones, but these were the best I could get." "I'm glad I emigrated," said Paddington as he reached out a paw and pulled the plate nearer. "Do you think anyone would mind if I stood on the table to eat?" Before Mr. Brown could answer, he had climbed up and placed his right paw firmly on the bun. It was a very large bun, the biggest and stickiest Mr. Brown had been able to find, and in a matter of moments most of the inside found its way onto Paddington's whiskers. People started to nudge each other and began staring in their direction. Mr. Brown wished he had chosen a plain, ordinary bun, but he wasn't very experienced in the ways of bears. He stirred his tea and looked down the window, pretending he had tea with a bear on Paddington Station every day of his life. "Henry!" The sound of his wife's voice brought him back to the earth with a start. "Henry, whatever are you doing to that poor bear? Look at him. He's covered all over with cream and jam." Mr. Brown jumped in confusion. "He seemed rather hungry," he answered lamely. Mrs. Brown turned to her daughter. "This is what happens when I leave your father alone for 5 minutes." Judy clasped her hand excitedly. "Oh, Daddy, is he really going to stay with us?" If he does," said Mr. Brown, "I can see someone other than your father will have to look after him. Just look at the mess he's in." Paddington, who all this time had been too interested in his bun to worry about what was going on, suddenly became aware that people were talking about him. He looked up to see that Mrs. Brown had been joined by a little girl with laughing blue eyes and long fair hair. He jumped up, meaning to raise his hat, and in his haste slipped on the patch of strawberry jam that somehow or another had found its way onto the glass tabletop. For a brief moment he had a dizzy expression on his face, impression of everything and everyone being upside down. He waved his paws wildly in the air, and then, before anyone could catch him, he somersaulted backwards and landed with a splash in his saucer of tea. He jumped up even quicker than he had sat down, because the tea was still very hot, and promptly stepped into Mr. Brown's cup. Judy threw her head back and laughed until the tears rolled down her face. "Oh, Mummy, isn't that funny?" she cried. Paddington, who didn't think it was funny at all, stood for a moment with one foot on the table and the other in Mr. Brown's tea. There were large patches of white cream all over his face, and his left ear was a lump of strawberry jam. "You wouldn't think," said Mrs. Brown, "that anyone could get in such a state with just one bun." Mr. Brown coughed. He had just caught the stern eye of a waitress on the other side of the counter. "Perhaps," he said. "We better go. I'll see if I can find a taxi." He picked up Judy's belongings and hurried outside. Paddington stepped gingerly off the table with a last look at the sticky remains of his bun, climbed down onto the floor. Judy took one of his paws. "Come along, Paddington. We'll take you home, and you can have a nice hot bath. Then you can tell me all about South America. I'm sure you must have had lots of wonderful adventures." "I have," said Paddington earnestly. "Lots. Things are always happening to me. I'm that sort of bear." When they came out of the cafe, Mr. Brown had already found a taxi, and he waved them across. The driver looked hard at Paddington, and then at the inside of his nice clean taxi. "Bears is extra," he said gruffly. "Sticky Bears is twice as much again." "He can't help being sticky, driver. He's just had a nasty accident." The driver hesitated. "All right, 'op in, but mind none of it comes off in the interior. I only cleaned it out this morning." The Browns trooped obediently into the back of the taxi. Mr. and Mrs. Brown and Judy sat in the back, while Paddington stood on a tip-up seat behind the driver so that he could see out of the window. The sun was shining as they drove out of the station, and after the gloom and the noise, everything seemed bright and cheerful. They swept past a group of people at a bus stop, and Paddington waved. Several people stared, and one man raised his hat in return. It was all very friendly. After weeks of sitting alone in a lifeboat, there wasn't much to see. There were people and cars and big red buses everywhere. It wasn't like darkest Peru. Paddington kept one eye on the window so he wouldn't miss anything. With his other eye, he carefully examined Mr. and Mrs. Brown and Judy. Mr. Brown was fat and jolly with a mustache and glasses, while Mrs. Brown, who was also rather plump, looked like a larger edition of Judy. Paddington had just decided that he was going to like staying with the Browns when the glass window behind the driver shot back and a gruff voice said, "Where did you say you want to go?" Mr. Brown leaned forward. "Number 32, Windsor Gardens." The driver cupped his ear with one hand. "Can't hear ya," he shouted. Paddington tapped him on the shoulder. "Number 32, Windsor Gardens." The taxi driver jumped at the sound of voice and nearly missed hitting a bus. He looked down at his shoulder and glared. "Cream," he said bitterly, "all over me new coat." Judy giggled, and Mr. and Mrs. Brown exchanged glances. Mr. Brown peered at the meter. He had half expected to see a sign go up that said they had to pay another 50 pence. "I beg your pardon," said Paddington. He bent forward and tried to rub the stain off with his paw. Several bun crumbs and a smear of jam added themselves mysteriously to the taxi driver's coat. The driver gave Paddington a long, hard look. Paddington raised his hat, and the driver slammed the window shut again. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown. "We really should give him a bath as soon as we get indoors. It's getting everywhere." Paddington looked thoughtful. It wasn't so much that he didn't like baths. He really didn't mind being covered in cream and jam. It seemed a pity to wash it all off quite so soon. But before he had time to consider the matter, the taxi stopped, and the Browns began to climb out. Paddington picked up his suitcase and followed Judy up a flight of white steps to a big green door. "Now you're going to meet Miss Bird," said Judy. "She looks after us. She's a bit fierce sometimes and grumbles a lot, but she doesn't really mean it. I'm sure you'll like her. Paddington felt his knees begin to tremble. He looked round for Mr. and Mrs. Brown, but they appeared to be having some sort of argument with the taxi driver. Behind the door he could hear footsteps approaching. "I'm sure I shall like her, if you say so," he said, catching sight of his reflection on the bright polished letterbox. "But will she like me?" You have sweet dreams, and get some sleep, and I'll read you another chapter tomorrow. I love you. Good night.